I was sitting on my bed and staring at my phone, thinking, my life is finally stable. I said softly, everything feels right now. I smiled and texted Aisha, are you free tonight? Aisha replied quickly, I am busy, Armin. Family is here. Her message felt normal, but something in her tone felt different. I shook my head and told myself, stop overthinking. I met Bilal outside the office the next day. I said, bro, life is perfect. I am getting married soon. Bilal smiled and said, yes, Armin, you deserve it. But he avoided my eyes for a second. I noticed it, but laughed it off. Why are you acting strange? I asked him. Bilal replied, nothing, just tired from work. At office, Usman called me. He said, Armin, your performance is excellent. Keep it up. I smiled and replied, thank you, sir. I will not disappoint you. Maria walked beside me later and said quietly, Armin, can I tell you something? I nodded and said, yes, what is it? She looked nervous and said, I saw Aisha yesterday in a cafe. She was with someone familiar. I frowned and said, probably family member. Maria said, maybe, but something felt off. I forced a smile and said, Maria, don't worry. Aisha is honest. But inside I felt a small discomfort growing. That night I called Aisha. I said, you sounded busy today. Aisha replied, yes, I was helping a home. I said, I miss you. She said softly, I miss you too, Armin. Next morning, I met my parents. My mother, Sima, said, Aisha is a good girl, right? I replied, yes, Amy, she is perfect. My father, Imran, said, then we are happy for you. I smiled and said, I am lucky. Later, I saw Bilal again. I said, let's plan my engagement properly. Bilal nodded and said, of course, I will handle everything. But again, he seemed distracted. I asked him, are you hiding something? Bilal quickly said, no, why would I? I laughed and said, just checking, you are like my brother. Bilal said, yes, brother. I believe him completely. I sat alone, later thinking, everything in my world feels safe. I did not know that cracks were already forming around me, silently and slowly. I walked toward the rooftop that evening and called Bilal again. I said, bro, come up for a smoke break. Bilal came after a pause and said, you are acting serious today. I smiled and said, maybe I just feel too happy. Bilal laughed lightly and said, that is good, Armin. I looked at the sky and said, do you think Aisha is the right choice for me? Bilal quickly replied, of course, she is perfect for you. Something in his answer felt too fast, too rehearsed. I stared at him and said, you answered too quickly. Bilal shrugged and said, because it is obvious. I nodded slowly, but inside my mind a small doubt started breathing. I went back home and saw Aisha's message again. I typed, I trust you completely. She replied, I know, Armin. I smiled, but my chest felt slightly heavy. I told myself, it is nothing. Everything is fine. Still, that night, I could not sleep easily. I kept repeating, everything is fine, everything is fine. Next morning, I reached office early, and Maria stopped me again. She said, Armin, you look tired. I replied, just thinking too much. Maria said about Aisha. I hesitated and said, maybe. Maria looked serious and said, be careful with blind trust. I forced a smile and said, I trust people who matter to me. At lunch, Bilal sat beside me and said, you are overthinking everything. I said, maybe you are right. Bilal laughed and said, you always worry too much. I nodded, but my silence grew heavier. In the evening, I called Aisha again and said, can we meet tomorrow? Aisha replied, I will try. I said, please, I miss you. She said, I miss you too. After call, I whispered to myself, then why does it feel like you are far away? I closed my eyes and told myself again, Armin, everything is still fine. Everything is fine. I stood near the window thinking, maybe I'm just tired. Maybe everything is truly normal. I told myself, Armin, stop doubting people you love. Still, my heart kept asking silent questions I could not answer, and I walked back to my room, feeling uneasy but hopeful inside again. I sat alone in my room and said, something feels different in Aisha's behavior. I said, maybe I'm just overthinking again. I opened my phone and texted Aisha, "Are you busy again tonight?" Aisha replied, "Yes, Armin, I am busy with family matters." I frowned and said, "You have been busy a lot lately." Aisha replied, "Work pressure is high, please understand." I said quietly, "I do understand, but something feels off." Next day, I met Bilal outside office and said, "You seem different too." Bilal said, "I am just tired, Armin, nothing else." I looked at him and said, "Why are you avoiding my questions?" Bilal laughed and said, "You are thinking too much, bro." I smiled, but inside, I felt something strange growing. Hassan called me and said, "Armin, stay careful with blind trust." I replied, "I trust Aisha and Bilal completely." Hassan said, "Trust is good, but not blind trust." I ended call and said, "Nothing is wrong, I know it." Maria stopped me in office and said, "I saw Aisha again yesterday." I said, "Maybe you misunderstood her, Maria." Maria said, "She was with the same man again." I said firmly, "Aisha would not do something like that." Maria looked disappointed and walked away silently. I stood still thinking, why is everyone doubting Aisha? One evening, I saw Aisha laughing at her phone. I said, "Who are you talking to?" Aisha quickly had phone and said, "Just family group chat." I nodded but felt uneasy inside my chest. I whispered, "Why did she hide it so fast?" That night, I said to myself, maybe I am imagining things. I closed my eyes and said, everything is still fine. But my heart kept asking questions I could not answer. I said softly, "Armin, stop doubting people you love." I walked to balcony and looked at the dark sky, silently. I said, maybe work stress is making me think too much. Hassan messaged me saying, "Meet me tomorrow, we need to talk." I replied, "Okay, Hassan, I will come." Next morning, I saw Bilal again at office entrance. I said, "You are really acting strange these days." Bilal replied, "You should focus on your engagement, Armin." I laughed and said, "I am focused, but I notice things." Bilal said, "Stop overthinking small things, bro." I nodded and said nothing more. Maria came again and said, "Armin, I need to tell you something serious." I said, "Tell me, Maria, I am listening." Maria said, "I saw Bilal and Aisha together near cafe." I froze and said, "That is not possible." Maria said, "I am just telling what I saw." I said, "Maybe it was coincidence, Maria." Maria left, and I stood confused again. I said to myself, why is everyone pointing fingers? That evening I saw Aisha smiling at her phone again. I asked, "Who makes you smile like that?" Aisha said, "Just a funny message, Armin." I said, "You seem happier on phone than with me." Aisha said softly, "You are overthinking again." I smiled weakly and said nothing. I walked away thinking something is breaking inside me. I whispered, "Trust is still there, but it feels weaker." I closed my eyes and said, "I will not lose trust." But deep inside I knew something had already changed. I sat alone again and said, why does everything feel unclear now? Hassan called and said, "Armin, meet me now, urgent." I replied, "I am coming, Hassan." I walked fast thinking something is about to change. Hassan said, "You need to open your eyes, Armin." I said, "I trust them too much, maybe." Hassan said, "That is your problem." I said, "I do not want to believe anything bad." Hassan said, "Truth will hurt, but lies will destroy you." I stayed silent and looked down. I said softly, "I just want peace in my life." Hassan said, "Then face truth, Armin." I nodded, but still refused to accept reality. I walked back home, feeling my trust slowly cracking. I said, "Aisha cannot betray me." But my voice felt weak even to me. I sat on bed and said, "Everything will be fine again." Still, I felt first crack in my trust forming. I whispered, "I will protect my trust no matter what happens." I closed my phone and tried to sleep, but could not. I said, something inside me knows truth is getting closer. I stared at ceiling and said, I am not ready for pain. Not yet now. I followed Bilal quietly that evening, thinking I was just being paranoid. I told myself, Armin, you are overthinking again, just go back. But something inside me forced me to keep walking behind him. I whispered, why am I doing this to myself, Armin? Bilal stopped near a cafe, and I hid behind a wall. I saw Aisha standing there with Bilal, laughing like nothing mattered. My heart froze when I saw Bilal holding Aisha's hand tightly. I said nothing, just watched them from distance as my world cracked. Aisha said softly, "Bilal, I cannot keep hiding this anymore." Bilal replied, "We will tell Armin later when everything is stable." I felt my chest burn when I heard my name from their betrayal. I stepped back slowly and whispered, "This cannot be real." I turned away and walked without letting them see my face. Inside me, something broke permanently that I could never repair again. I called Hassan immediately and said, "Hassan, I need to meet you now." Hassan replied, "Armin, what happened? Your voice sounds broken." I said, "I saw them, Hassan. I saw everything." Hassan stayed silent and then said, "Come to me right now." I walked like a lifeless body toward Hassan's place. Hassan opened the door and said, "Armin, sit down slowly." I sat and said, "My life just ended in front of my eyes." Hassan said, "This is betrayal, Armin, not confusion." I kept repeating, "Why Bilal? Why Aisha? Why me?" Hassan grabbed my shoulder and said, "You need to stay strong." I whispered, "I trusted them like family, Hassan." Hassan said, "That trust is broken now." I left Hassan's place feeling empty inside. I saw my father, Imran, waiting at home. Imran asked, "Armin, why are you so silent today?" I said, "I'm just tired, Abu." Imran looked at me and said nothing more. I went to my room and closed the door. I sat alone and whispered, "My life is not mine anymore." I stared at the wall, thinking everything I believed was fake. I said softly, "Aisha, Bilal, you destroyed me." I received a message from Maria saying, "I'm here if you need me." I replied, "Everything is finished, Maria." I lay down and said, "This is my breaking point." I kept seeing Aisha and Bilal in my mind again and again. I shouted softly, "Why did you do this to me?" I felt tears, but I did not let them fall. I said, "Armin, you must survive this pain." I closed my eyes and tried to breathe slowly. I knew nothing in my life would be same again. I whispered, "This is the day everything changed." I got up and said, "I will not collapse." I promised myself, I will face truth no matter what. I walked outside feeling dead inside, but standing still. I said, "This is only beginning of truth." I called Hassan again and said, "I cannot forget what I saw." Hassan said, "You don't need to forget. You need to accept." I said, "Accepting this feels like dying slowly." Hassan said, "Truth always hurts before it heals." I nodded and said, "Then I am already broken." I sat outside Hassan's house in silence. I said, "I cannot go back to my normal life." Hassan said, "Your life is changing, not ending." I whispered, "It feels like ending to me." Hassan said, "Then rebuild from ashes." I stood up and said, "I will rebuild everything." I walked home thinking nothing will ever be same. I said softly, "Aisha, you destroyed something real." I clenched my fists and kept walking. I said, "Bilal, I trusted you like brother." I felt anger rising, but I stayed silent. I reached home and locked my door. I said, "This is my emotional collapse." I sat in darkness and thought about everything. I whispered, "I will never trust easily again." I closed my eyes and felt broken completely. I said, "Armin, this pain will make you stronger." I stood in front of a mirror and looked at myself. I said, "This is not the same Armin anymore." I walked away from mirror feeling lost. I said, "My world ended without warning." I called Hassan one last time and said, "I will change everything now." Hassan said, "Then start from truth." I said, "I am ready for whatever comes next." I ended call and said, "This is my rebirth from pain." I walked into night knowing nothing will be same again. I whispered, "Armin will survive no matter what happens now." I looked at sky and said, "This truth destroyed my illusion." I walked forward and said, "I am no longer the same man." I finally accepted reality and said, everything I loved was a lie. I stood alone, thinking my life shattered. I sat alone in my room and said, something feels different in Aisha's behavior. I said, maybe I'm just overthinking again. I opened my phone and texted Aisha, "Are you busy again tonight?" Aisha replied, "Yes, Armin, I am busy with family matters." I frowned and said, "You have been busy a lot lately." Aisha replied, "Where pressure is high, please understand." I said quietly, "I do understand, but something feels off." Next day, I met Bilal outside office and said, "You seem different too." Bilal said, "I am just tired, Armin, nothing else." I looked at him and said, Why are you avoiding my questions? Bilal laughed and said, You are thinking too much, bro. I smiled, but inside, I felt something strange growing. Hassan called me and said, Armin, stay careful with blind trust. I replied, I trust Aisha and Bilal completely. Hassan said, Trust is good, but not blind trust. I ended call and said, Nothing is wrong, I know it. Maria stopped me in office and said, I saw Aisha again yesterday. I said, Maybe you misunderstood her, Maria. Maria said, She was with the same man again. I said firmly, Aisha would not do something like that. Maria looked disappointed and walked away silently. I stood still thinking, why is everyone doubting Aisha? One evening, I saw Aisha laughing at her phone. I said, Who are you talking to? Aisha quickly had phone and said, Just family group chat. I nodded but felt uneasy inside my chest. I whispered, Why did she hide it so fast? That night, I said to myself, Maybe I am imagining things. I closed my eyes and said, Everything is still fine. But my heart kept asking questions I could not answer. I said softly, Armin, stop doubting people you love. I walked to the balcony and looked at the dark sky, silently. I said, Maybe work stress is making me think too much. Hassan messaged me saying, Meet me tomorrow, we need to talk. I replied, Okay, Hassan, I will come. Next morning, I saw Bilal again at office entrance. I said, You are really acting strange these days. Bilal replied, You should focus on your engagement, Armin. I laughed and said, I am focused, but I notice things. Bilal said, Stop overthinking small things, bro. I nodded and said nothing more. Maria came again and said, Armin, I need to tell you something serious. I said, Tell me, Maria, I am listening. Maria said, I saw Bilal and Aisha together near cafe. I froze and said, That is not possible. Maria said, I am just telling what I saw. I said, Maybe it was coincidence, Maria. Maria left, and I stood confused again. I said to myself, Why is everyone pointing fingers? That evening I saw Aisha smiling at her phone again. I asked, Who makes you smile like that? Aisha said, Just a funny message, Armin. I said, You seem happier on phone than with me. Aisha said softly, You are overthinking again. I smiled weakly and said nothing. I walked away thinking something is breaking inside me. I whispered, Trust is still there, but it feels weaker. I closed my eyes and said, I will not lose trust. But deep inside I knew something had already changed. I sat alone again and said, Why does everything feel unclear now? Hassan called and said, Armin, meet me now, urgent. I replied, I am coming, Hassan. I walked fast thinking something is about to change. Hassan said, You need to open your eyes, Armin. I said, I trust them too much, maybe. Hassan said, That is your problem. I said, I do not want to believe anything bad. Hassan said, Truth will hurt, but lies will destroy you. I stayed silent and looked down. I said softly, I just want peace in my life. Hassan said, Then face truth, Armin. I nodded, but still refused to accept reality. I walked back home, feeling my trust slowly cracking. I said, Aisha cannot betray me. But my voice felt weak even to me. I sat on bed and said, Everything will be fine again. Still, I felt first crack in my trust forming. I whispered, I will protect my trust no matter what happens. I closed my phone and tried to sleep, but could not. I said, Something inside me knows truth is getting closer. I stared at ceiling and said, I am not ready for pain. Not yet now. I walked into Usman's office and said calmly, Sir, I need to show you something about Bilal. Usman looked at me and said, What is it, Armin? I placed the files on the table and said, Financial records don't match his reports. Usman frowned and said, Are you sure? I replied, I checked everything twice. Usman leaned back and said, This is serious. I said, Yes, sir, but I didn't want to ignore it. Usman nodded and said, I will investigate quietly. I replied, That's enough for me. I left the office and said to myself, Now truth will start moving on its own. Next day, Bilal called me and said, Armin, I'm under pressure at work. I replied, Everyone faces pressure. Bilal said, Something feels like I'm being targeted. I said calmly, Maybe you're just stressed. Bilal said loudly, I know someone is doing this. I replied, then find proof. I ended the call and stayed silent. Aisha met me later and said, Bilal is not sleeping properly these days. I looked at her and said, maybe he is busy. She said, he is changing, Armin. I replied, people change. Aisha looked at me and said, you sound different. I said, I'm just tired. She held my hand and said, we need to talk more. I gently pulled my hand away and said, not today. Aisha looked shocked and said, why are you acting like this? I replied, nothing is wrong. Inside I felt nothing anymore. Maria met me in office and said, Bilal is under investigation now. I replied, I heard. Maria said, you are not reacting at all. I said, I already expected it. Maria looked at me and said, this is not the Armin I know. I replied, people evolve. She stayed silent after that. Later, I met Zoya again at a family gathering. She said softly, you are Armin. I nodded and said, yes. Zoya looked at me and said, you are very quiet. I replied, I prefer silence now. Zoya said, Bilal is not doing well. I said calmly, I know. Zoya looked surprised and said, you know? I replied, yes. Zoya paused and said, but you don't look angry. I said, anger is useless now. Zoya stared at me and said, you are not like other people. I replied, I had no choice. From that day, Zoya started talking to me more often. She would ask, why don't you talk to Bilal anymore? I always replied, some things don't need words. Zoya slowly started respecting my silence. Meanwhile, Bilal's life started breaking. He called me one night and said, Armin, I lost my project. I replied, it happens. Bilal shouted, someone is ruining me. I said calmly, maybe it is consequences. Bilal said, you sound like you know something. I replied, I don't. I ended the call. Aisha later said to me, you are emotionally far now. I replied, I am just focused. Aisha said, I feel like I am losing you. I said, no one owns anyone. She went silent after that. I sat alone and said, Aisha is starting to feel fear. I smiled slightly and said, good. At work, Bilal became more unstable. He argued with staff, shouted at meetings, and lost control. Usman said to me, this is falling apart faster than expected. I replied, truth always collapses quickly. Usman said, you are too calm in all this. I said, because I'm not inside the storm anymore. He looked at me and said nothing. At night, I met Hassan and he said, everything you predicted is happening. I replied, I didn't predict it. I just waited. Hassan said, this is getting dangerous. I said, no, this is getting clear. Hassan said, what do you feel now? I replied, nothing emotional. Hassan looked worried and said, that scares me. I said, it shouldn't. Days passed, and Bilal kept falling deeper into stress. Aisha kept hiding her confusion. Zoya kept observing silently. I watched everything like a quiet shadow. One evening, Maria said, you are watching everything burn. I replied, I am watching truth appear. Maria said, you are not helping. I said, I am not stopping either. She said, why? I replied, because some fires must finish burning. At home, I sat alone and said, Bilal, your collapse is not random. I closed my eyes and said, this is karma moving slowly. I stood up and said, Aisha will feel it next. For the first time, I didn't feel pain or anger, only control. Aisha came to me and said softly, Armin, we need to fix us. I looked at her and replied, what needs fixing? She said, we are drifting apart. I said calmly, maybe we already did. Aisha grabbed my hand and said, please don't talk like this. I gently pulled my hand away and said, I am just speaking the truth. She looked scared and said, you are not the same, Armin. I replied, people change when they see reality. Aisha whispered, I still love you. I said, love should not feel like confusion. She stayed silent after that. Later, Bilal called me angrily and said, everything is falling because of you. I replied, no, Bilal, it is falling because of truth. Bilal shouted, Aisha destroyed me. I said calmly, you both made your choices. Bilal said, I trusted you like a brother. I replied, so did I. I ended the call. Aisha met Bilal secretly, but their arguments grew louder now. I heard through Maria that Bilal said, "You ruined everything for me." Aisha replied, "You promised me stability." Their secret bond was breaking on its own. That evening, Zoya called me and said, "Armin, can we meet alone?" I replied, "Yes." We met at a quiet place. Zoya looked at me and said, "You are carrying something heavy." I said, "I already lost everything important." Zoya asked softly, "What happened between you, Aisha, and Bilal?" I stayed silent for a moment and said, "Truth destroyed everything." Zoya looked down and said, "Bilal is not the same anymore." I replied, "Neither am I." Zoya said, "You look calm but broken inside." I said, "I stopped showing pain." Zoya asked, "Why are you still silent about everything?" I replied, "Because truth does not need shouting." She looked at me and said, "I understand now." For the first time, I felt someone actually understood me. I said quietly, "I am tired of betrayal." Zoya replied, "Then don't live inside it." I looked at her and said, "What if I choose a different path?" Zoya asked, "What path?" I paused and said, "A path where I don't chase revenge, but rebuild life." Zoya stayed silent. Then I said the words that changed everything. "I want to marry you, Zoya." She froze and said, "Me?" I replied, "Not out of revenge, out of truth and peace." Zoya looked confused and said, "This is because of Bilal?" I said firmly, "No, this is because of my life now." Zoya lowered her eyes and said nothing for a while. She finally said, "I don't want to be part of revenge." I replied, "Then don't be. Be part of new life." Zoya stayed quiet but didn't refuse. At home, I told my parents Imran and Saima. Imran said, "Armin, are you serious?" I replied, "Yes, Abu." Saima said, "But Zoya is Bilal's sister." I said calmly, "I know." Imran asked, "Is this because of anger?" I said, "No, it is because I am done with pain." Silence filled the room. Saima looked worried and said, "Will this bring more problems?" I replied, "My life is already full of problems." Imran looked at me carefully and said, "If this brings you peace, we support you." I nodded and said, "That is all I want." Later, Zoya met my parents. She said softly, "I'm not here to take revenge." Imran replied, "We know." Saima looked at her and said, "Do you accept this decision?" Zoya hesitated and said, "I accept it with respect, not emotion." I looked at her and said, "That is enough for me." Aisha heard about it later and called me immediately. She said loudly, "You are marrying Zoya?" I replied, "Yes." Aisha said, "Is this your revenge?" I said calmly, "No, Aisha. This is your consequence." She cried and said, "You are punishing me." I replied, "I stopped punishing anyone. Life did it already." Bilal also called me and shouted, "You betrayed me." I said, "You betrayed yourself first." He stayed silent. After the call, I sat alone and said, "Everything is ending the way it should." Zoya came later and said, "I still don't fully understand this." I replied, "You don't need to understand everything." She asked, "Will you ever forgive them?" I said, "I already stopped feeling hatred." Zoya looked at me and said, "Then I will stand with you." I nodded slowly and said, "Then this is our beginning." For the first time, I felt life moving forward instead of backward. I stood at the simple ceremony and said, "I am ready, Zoya." Zoya looked at me and said softly, "I am ready too, Armin." I nodded and said, "Then let's begin a new life, not a revenge story." The imam spoke words, but I only heard my heartbeat settling. I said, "I never thought my life would end up here." Zoya replied, "Neither did I, but I am not afraid." I said, "Good, because I am done with fear." After the ceremony, I said, "We are married now." Zoya replied, "Yes, but I still feel your pain inside you." I said, "It is fading slowly." Bilal was standing far away watching. He came closer and said, "Armin, you really did this?" I said calmly, "Yes, Bilal, I moved on." Bilal shouted, "You destroyed me." I replied, "No, Bilal, your choices did that." He said, "I lost everything." I said, "Then learn from it." He fell silent and his hands trembled. I looked at him and said, "This is your consequence, not my revenge." He walked away broken. Aisha came later, eyes filled with tears. She said, Armin, please talk to me. I said, what is left to talk about? She said, I made a mistake. I replied, a mistake does not feel like betrayal unless it lasts for months. She cried, I lost you forever. I said, yes, and I lost my old self too. She whispered, are you happy now? I said, not happy, but peaceful. Zoya held my hand and said, you don't need to carry this anymore. I said, I'm trying. She said, then walk forward, not backward. I nodded and said, with you I can. Maria came and said, you stayed strong, Armin. I replied, I had no choice. Maria smiled and said, but you chose peace. I said, yes, finally. Hassan came and said, I am proud of you. I replied, I survived, that's all. Hassan said, no, you rebuilt yourself. My father Imran said, you look calm now. I replied, I feel calm, Abu. My mother Saima said, this is the Armin we prayed for. I smiled and said, I am still healing, Ami. Zoya looked at me and said, what now? I said, now we live, no more running. She smiled and said, no more past. I said, only future. We walked slowly together. Behind us, Bilal stood alone, losing everything he built. Aisha sat alone, realizing she lost both love and stability. I said quietly, Karma did not need my help. Zoya said, do you feel hatred now? I said, no, only silence. She said, that is healing. I nodded and said, maybe this is what peace feels like. Maria waved goodbye and said, stay strong. I replied, I will stay steady, not strong. Hassan said, don't look back. I said, I won't. I looked at the sky and said, I am not that broken man anymore. Zoya said, you're someone new now. I said, no, I'm just prepared. We walked forward together, leaving everything behind. I said, this is not revenge. Zoya asked, then what is it? I said, it is peace finally choosing me. I held her hand and said, let's keep walking. We walked away from the place slowly, leaving the noise behind us. I said, Zoya, I never thought silence could feel this light. Zoya replied, silence only feels heavy when truth is unspoken. I nodded and said, I spent too long inside that weight. She looked at me and said, now you are outside it. I replied, yes, and I don't want to go back. I stopped for a moment and looked back once. I said, everything I lost is still there, but it no longer owns me. Zoya asked, do you still think about them? I said, I think, but it doesn't hurt anymore. She said softly, that is real healing. I replied, it feels strange, like learning to breathe again. We continued walking and I said, I used to believe love was everything. Zoya said, and now? I replied, now I believe peace is everything. She smiled and said, that sounds like you finally found yourself. I said, maybe I did, after losing everything I thought I was. I took a deep breath and said, I will not carry anger into tomorrow. Zoya said, then tomorrow will be lighter. I nodded and said, I want simple days now, nothing heavy. She replied, we will build them together. I looked at her and said, together sounds new to me. I whispered, Armin is not broken anymore, just different. Zoya said, different is enough. I said, then let's keep moving forward and never look back again. I said softly, peace finally feels real in my life, and I will protect it always now here.